Well, as people file in, we can at least start our intro. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Cary. Before we begin, if you're experiencing any technical issues, feel free to message me in the chat and I can try to help you. If you have any questions for our speaker tonight, please use the Q&A button and you should be able to send them there. We'll address them at the end. Also, if you want to use the raise hand function, you can do that as well. Lastly, this program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation and in partnership with several regional libraries. With us tonight is Annalee Newitz, pronouns they, them. They write science fiction and nonfiction. They're the author of 3 novels, The Terraformers, The Future of Another Timeline, and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award. As a science journal, they're the author of Stories Are Weapons, Psychological Warfare in the American Mind, which is the subject of tonight's talk. They're also the author of 4 Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age and Scatter, Adapt, and Remember How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize in Science. They're a writer for the New York Times and elsewhere, and have a monthly column in New Scientist. They've published in Washington Post, Slate, Scientific American, and other publications. They're the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. They've contributed to the public radio shows Science Friday, On the Media, KQED Forum, and Here and Now. Previously, they were the founder of IO9 and served as the editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. So now, please welcome Annalee.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that awesome introduction, Matt. I am really glad to be here tonight, and for those of you who are coming in from where I am on the West Coast, late afternoon, I can't think of any better place to start talking about how to cope with disinformation and propaganda than a library, because libraries are really important public space. And it's a kind of place that we're going to want to keep protecting as we go into this new era in American politics characterized by Trump's form of authoritarianism. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is basically what I discovered over the past 4 years of researching disinformation, propaganda, and psychological operations in the United States. So my research focused exclusively on the ways in which the American government and American politicians, Americans with power, have used the media to propagate their messages and to try to affect the course of world events. So I'm only focused on just what does America do to other nations, but most specifically what America does to itself. And this is really relevant to what's happening to us right now in the United States, even though it is a book about the deep history of this topic, because one of the things that I discovered when I first started working on this book, which was during the previous Trump administration, I was really interested in what is psychological warfare? What does it mean? Like, where does it come from? You know, these sort of big historical questions. And the more I researched it, the more I discovered that a lot of the tactics and strategies that we think of as being psychological warfare, and I'll get to definitions in a second because it is important that you understand what I mean by psychological warfare, but a lot of those strategies, they grow out of military engagements, but during the 20th century, they were taken up domestically in the United States. So a lot of the strategies that the country had been using in foreign conflicts came home to roost. And you started to see American politicians using those same strategies against other Americans. And that's when psychological war becomes culture war. Culture war looks almost like a psychological war, but it's domestic. And that's my argument in the book. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm actually this is not a talk I've done before. I've kind of changed the way I do this talk because obviously things have changed. And so I'm going to walk you through the history of how the United States government specifically engages in psychological warfare and propaganda. Like, what is our specific flavor of propaganda? Because it's different from Russian propaganda, Chinese propaganda, Brazilian propaganda. We have our own thing, our own way of doing it. So I'm going to talk to you about that. And then I'm going to talk to you about how those kinds of, how our history with psychological war, how we develop tactics that then have entered our culture wars. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how psychological war becomes culture war. And then most importantly, I'll talk to you about resistance. How do we resist propaganda? What are some historical examples of how people have resisted and continue to resist? And it's important as we go through this to keep in mind, one of the things that I found is that it is very difficult to win in a culture war context. There's no, we talk a lot about like, well, how do we win the propaganda war? How do we win the information war? There are strategies for resisting. There's strategies for pushing back, for protecting yourself and your communities. But one of the pernicious aspects of culture war and psychological war is there really is no end game. There's no winner. There's no way to surrender. What you can do is push for a kind of psychological peace or disarmament. So that's kind of the goal of a lot of these resistance movements, is not so much to crush the enemy, because once you're crushing the enemy, you're back at war, but instead to de-escalate and to try to create a realm of cultural peace where people are not threatening each other and trying to harm each other. Okay, so that's what I'm hoping to do in the next half hour, and then I'll open it up for questions. I'd really love to hear what you guys are thinking, and if you have other questions about how this applies to today, because what we're going to do is really look back at the history and kind of open up a big picture here. So first of all, when I talk about psychological war, and when I say, psyop or psychological operation, what the heck does that mean? So psychological war is a form of warfare that goes back thousands of years. We don't know when it started. There's no person who wrote the ultimate guide. We do know that, the famous book Art of War does include a section on psychological war. And it's usually viewed as an alternative, a welcome alternative to kinetic war, violent war, where people murder each other. Sort of viewed as like, gee, if we could just engage in kind of trickery and subterfuge, wouldn't that be better than bombing each other? So in a military context, it's almost kind of the goal, right? Like you'd rather have a war of words than a war of bullets. But in reality, psychological war, as we've experienced it in the United States, has always been connected with a kinetic war. So it's always a part of a larger strategy of murdering or physically harming a population, a foreign adversary. And psychological war is anytime you have a military organization or a state actor or non-state actor that is funded specifically to create messages intended to undermine the morale of a foreign adversary. So keep in mind the foreign adversary part. In the United States, this has traditionally been aimed at non-American people. And this kind of message, you can undermine the morale of an enemy a number of ways. One way is to lie and confuse them, to send messages that mislead people. You can send messages intended to traumatize people, just like horrifying messages that are disturbing. They almost always contain violent threats. So, if you don't do what we say, we're gonna kill you or kill your family, or you're gonna lose your job, or you're gonna be sent away somewhere. Any kind of threat like that is part of a psyop. It can also be, and I think this is something we have to think about a lot now, the goal of a psyop can also be just to confuse you, to actually create what military analysts call the fog of war. And the fog of war is just that moment when you're in a war where things are so chaotic that it's almost impossible to know what decision to make, because you just don't have enough information about what the enemy is doing, maybe even about what your own troops are doing. And it's a terrifying place to be. And many psyops now, especially in the Trump era, aim to create that the psychology of being in that kind of fog, of not knowing what's real, what's true, how to make a choice, how to see a pathway forward, because you get so much false information, so much emotionally arousing information, not arousing in a good way, but like emotionally upsetting, that it becomes its own kind of, it becomes a form of being demoralized, because you just don't know what's going on. The thing about psyops too is that psychological warfare, the messages that come out of the military or out of the state often contain facts. I think there's a kind of myth that propaganda is all lies, disinformation is all lies, and then there's facts on the other side of it. The reality is that psyops work partly because they do usually contain some grain of truth. Like for example, they might contain the grain of truth that, like, yeah, a lot of people are hurting right now economically. A lot of people are struggling financially right now in the United States. That's true. But presenting that information with the intent to educate people is one thing. But if you're a propagandist, you take that grain of truth, that actual verifiable fact, and you wrap it in some kind of ideology, or you wrap it in a lie, like, oh, you're hurting economically because of immigrants, or you're hurting economically because trans people are just like sucking up all of the money in the entire budget to like throw parties with lots of glitter. Glitter is incredibly expensive, and that's why you're hurting economically. Sadly, that is not an actual piece of propaganda, but anyway, that's the idea, is that you always, propaganda and psyops often have this element of truth. Not always, but it is a strong aspect of them. So when we think of psyops, psychological operations, we often think of the Cold War. We think of that being kind of this great era of psychological warfare in the United States, and it was. There were a lot of people working in intelligence and psychological operations, and one of the first books to kind of codify how to engage in psychological warfare does grow out of that period in our country. However, what I'm going to argue and kind of walk you through now is that our notion in the United States of how to engage in psychological warfare actually starts in the 19th century with the Indian Wars. This was a whole set of wars, mostly in the 19th century, that the US government and also local militias waged against indigenous nations and tribes. And that was a kinetic war against a foreign enemy, but it also was the moment when the government really hit upon the playbook that it's still using now to send out these weaponized messages intended to demoralize the enemy, but also to confuse the American people as well. So let me tell you a tiny bit about the Indian Wars. A number of fantastic scholars and historians have written about the Indian Wars. I highly encourage you to go check out Ned Blackhawk's work on the Indian Wars if you want to really ground yourself in the history. What I want to focus on here are just the ways in which these wars contain psychological operations. So first of all, the Indian Wars were kinetic wars. People were being killed by the US government, by police. They were being killed by militias. There was a whole genocidal program going on. However, there was messaging coming from the US government to Indigenous people saying, we want you to move from Florida to Oklahoma. If you don't, we will kill you. So even though actual murder was taking place, the psychological operation was the threat of murder. So you had actual killing, and then you had messages about how if you don't do what the government says, we will kill you. And the reason why it's an effective psyop is because people knew that they might die if they didn't do what the government said. So there were tons and tons in the 1830s and 40s and all the way up through the 19th century. Of course, there were tons of forced relocations of nations and tribes. under that kind of threat. You know, the way that people were moved was because they were given these messages. More importantly, I think to today's experience is that the Indian Wars were characterized by a multi-decade long re-education project. The US government used the War Department to attack Indigenous education systems and Indigenous ways of living in families, Indigenous ways of living on the land, and forced thousands and thousands of Indigenous children to go to residential schools and be re-educated in English language, in the English language, in Christianity, in European systems of agriculture. This is really the residential schools that, of course, lasted all the way up, in many cases, through the 1960s, were America's first brainwashing program. And it's funny because, again, like we think of the term brainwashing as being a Cold War idea, like, oh no, the communists are going to brainwash us. And indeed it was. That was a huge meme in the 1950s and the 60s. But it was really the US government that first came up with that idea of specifically targeting education as an area that they should attack in a psychological war, and that they should rebuild the education systems of Indigenous tribes, replace them with European systems and American systems as a form of psychological terror, but also as a form of psychological manipulation. And again, right now, no surprise that as we see an authoritarian government rising, we're seeing so much moral panic, so much legislation around education, because education is a big part of how we engage in psychological war and culture war. The other part that is really, really important to know about the Indian Wars is that these were wars that were also fought in the arena of pop culture. And if you went to school in the United States, you may have been forced to read James Fenimore Cooper's famous 1830s novel, The Last of the Mohicans. It was a huge bestseller at the time. It came out right during the height of Indian relocations, when the US government was forcing Indigenous tribes and nations to move far across the country to new places, when genocidal activities were quite high. And this novel presented that whole experience, that whole bloody, terrible set of wars, as being a kind of natural, inevitable, and even a kind of swashbuckling good time sort of thing. And the main message of that novel, or the kind of underlying message, I mean, it has a lot of elements, but it's basically an adventure story that kind of that suggests, yeah, it's sad that the Indigenous people are dying out, but it's just kind of natural and normal, and that's just kind of how things are. And that idea that there was a kind of naturalness or inevitability to the destruction and genocide of Indigenous cultures, that was a psyop, and it went very far toward persuading the white settler public that, you know, the Indian Wars are just kind of how it goes. You know, that's just war. It's just life, you know. And so it's a great example of how the United States has always used pop culture as part of its arsenal of weapons in psychological war. Another little moment in pop culture toward the end of the 19th century is also really important to keep in mind. And that is a famous essay that came out in the 1890s by Frederick Jackson Turner, and it was called The Frontier Thesis. This is another thing that you may have read at some point in school if you were raised in the United States. And basically, Turner was a historian, a popular historian. He was a big popularizer of ideas. So like, if he were around today, he would be like a Malcolm Gladwell type guy. He was he would have these big public lectures that people loved. And so his thesis in his frontier thesis was a kind of echo of Last of the Mohicans. It was this idea that the United States was built out of the process of westward expansion of Europeans, and that as Europeans spread into the West, they absorbed the culture of Indigenous people and left no Indigenous people behind. And again, he uses the language of natural selection. He really wants to naturalize this notion that Indigenous culture and Indigenous people will be eradicated. But that's okay, because that's just part of how America works. And, Americans have absorbed all that Indigenousness into themselves and become uniquely American. And it's it's not even an apology. It's just a kind of, it's sort of using the language of science to justify cultural genocide and actual genocide. So that also was just a hugely popular essay, and it really helped to shore up support for not just the ongoing wars against tribes, but also the ongoing kidnapping of Indigenous kids and putting them into residential schools. Okay, so that's the backstory. We've got violent threats and actual violence. We've got attacks on the education system, and we've got pop culture, which is helping to shore up the US government's efforts in war. So those are that's the balanced breakfast of American psychological war. And we see these same patterns happening again and again. And in the 20th century, a figure comes into this field who I talk a lot about in my book. His name's Paul Linebarger, and he wrote the first book on psychological war in the 1940s, but he had grown up in the 1920s and 30s and was exposed to kind of the early stages of what we would call modern psychological war. So he's taking all of the stuff from the Indian Wars, and to that, he's adding what people have learned from Freudian psychology about how to manipulate people's feelings, and most importantly, the advertising industry. I cannot emphasize enough how wildly influential advertising and marketing are on contemporary military psychological operations. And again, I talk about this a lot in the book, but basically, if you look at American psychological warfare today, it is all of the stuff I talked about with the Indian Wars, plus a strong dose of information on target marketing and emotional manipulation through psychology. So it's kind of all squished together, and that is how the military creates what they call products that are aimed at a foreign adversary, intending to traumatize them, intending to undermine their morale, confuse them, get them to surrender, get them to come over to our side. But then, as I said, what happens basically during the Cold War, you start to see a turn where the US government is no longer using these tactics against foreign adversaries. I mean, they still are, they're still in the Cold War, so they're aiming these tactics at the Soviets, but they also begin to aim it at the enemy within. And the enemy within at the time in the 1950s, of course, is communism. It's also queer people. This is the era of the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare, two separate sets of congressional hearings prosecuting and persecuting communists and queer people, getting them fired from their jobs, getting them investigated, in some cases, destroying their lives long term. And so you start to see this idea of a foreign adversary transferring into the idea of a domestic adversary. And so culture wars kind of take up all this stuff from, like I said, from advertising, from psychology, using pop culture, attacking people with violent threats, attacking educational institutions, attacking libraries. All that happens now American versus American, basically. So let me give you a couple of examples of how that happens. Like what happens when you start to see culture wars resemble psychological wars. So I already mentioned the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. I talk a lot in the book about the lavender scare because there's a long history throughout the 20th century of demonizing uh, LGBT folks as un-American. And there's been different ways that that's done, but often it boils down to calling them groomers and saying that that LGBT folks shouldn't be working in the government, shouldn't be working in schools, um, and turning LGBT folks into a kind of internalized un-American group. We also see in culture wars, as I said, we see the rise, I shouldn't say the rise, we see throughout the 20th century an emphasis on Jim Crow laws and also immigration laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which focus on minority groups within the United States, many of whom are Americans, immigrants who've become citizens or Black people who've always been citizens, and treating them also as if they are kind of the foreign enemy within. I think Jim Crow laws are such an interesting example of culture war and psyops because it's a way of creating an internalized other nation, basically. I mean, under Jim Crow, Black communities are treated with a different set of laws than white communities. And it allows for all kinds of abuses. And of course, it's accompanied by pop culture representations of Black people being inferior. It's accompanied by attacks on Black educational institutions or attacks on Black education more generally. So again, this is all these strategies that we've seen in psychological war aimed at a foreign enemy now being aimed at Black Americans or now being aimed at Chinese Americans who are being victimized by various immigration rules, but also all kinds of rules. Like here in San Francisco, Chinese Americans were not allowed to live anywhere in the city except for one little area called Chinatown. And so they were also governed by a different set of laws and made to seem like a kind of alien within. The other thing we see in culture wars, again, starting kind of in the 1950s, is the use of pop culture to shore up the government's perspective and to get the general population to accept what's happening to all of these Americans who are being treated as if they are not American. So you see everything from like in the 50s, there's like classic sci-fi movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers that kind of arouse fear about like the enemy within, the kind of communists that are coming in to turn us into pod people. But you also have much more direct stuff. Like if we look at media today, we see all kinds of popular media like the platform X, for example, which is aimed at propagating all kinds of memes and misinformation that's intended to prop up a kind of MAGA Republican view of the world and to undermine the morale of anyone who doesn't share that perspective. The other thing is that a lot of this pop culture that we see influencing messages in culture war is kind of science fictional. Like if you ever look at kind of contemporary like conspiracy theories that are basically part of the culture war, a lot of them sound like bad 50s science fiction, like lasers that are causing hurricanes or vaccines that have like nanobots in them that are going to like take over your mind or whatever. I forget what the nanobots are doing in the vaccines, but something terrible other than autism. So there's the autism kind of myth about vaccines, but then there's also the like there's little robots in there too. And part of the reason that a lot of these conspiracy theories that are part of culture war sound like sci-fi is because a lot of folks who in the 1950s and 60s were working in intelligence agencies in the government were themselves science fiction writers. And so Paul Linebarger, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote this book on psychological war and helped to kind of codify some of these ways of using the media to get our messages across, he was a cult figure in the science fiction community, writing under the name Cordwainer Smith. Cordwainer Smith's work, by the way, a lot of it is about psychological war, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but if you've ever read any of his work or if you'd like to check it out, you'll immediately pick up on a lot of themes about how to manipulate people psychologically and get them to surrender or come around to your point of view. So what we see in culture war that has been borrowed from psychological war is the use of pop culture, like I said, including kind of sci-fi tropes about how our minds are being controlled or how there's like lasers in space. We also see the use of violent threats backed up with, actual violence. And that can go everything from, like I said, the Lavender Scare to modern day violent threats. All of those kinds of culture war threats, violent threats, come straight out of the psychological warfare book. And we see, again, an attack on education, an attack on the idea that people could think differently. I think part of the attack on communism during the Cold War, of course, plays into this idea that people who think differently, are automatically un-American. So the question is, how do we resist? And I'm going to finish up in the next few minutes talking about a few examples of how people have resisted psyops in culture war specifically, because I think what we really need to be worried about now going forward is the culture war that Trump's government will be waging on many groups that they will characterize as un-American. And I see that there's some questions in the chat, and I promise I will get to them in just a sec. So first of all, I have a kind of rubric that I often give people about like, how do we begin to fight? And the rubric is build schools, keep receipts, and tell better stories. And let me tell you what that means. First of all, build schools. It's pretty obvious that one of the ways that we're going to be attacked in the future through propaganda, but also historically have been attacked, is through the dismantling of educational institutions. You'll see government representatives or members of school boards, for example, attacking curricula, banning books, changing the way that teachers are allowed to talk about various subjects in the classroom, more government control over education. And, like I said, this goes all the way back to residential schools in the 19th century. This is a very old playbook for the US government. So one way that an attacked minority group in the United States fought back was in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, Black people started building Black colleges and getting funding for Black colleges. And there's a reason why Kamala Harris used Howard as kind of the locus of her. She was going to have her acceptance speech and then had her concession speech there. And of course, that is her alma mater. But that's because historically Black colleges have been not just an important part of Black culture, but also an important part of de-escalating and pushing back against this element of the culture war that has tried to portray Black people as being inferior and therefore not needing education, or not needing education that had as many resources as, say, white education, like white universities or white schools. So building a school or creating an educational environment, whether it's here online or somewhere else, that is one way to fight back and to give the community a place for educating each other, skill shares, but also for showing the world that that community, whether it's that community, even if it's being denigrated, actually can create its own educational system that is just as powerful and valid as other systems. Another thing that's really important, as I said, keep receipts. By that I mean maintain records of what has happened historically. So, of course, one of the main ways that people get attacked in a culture war is basically to be gaslit, to be told what you think happened didn't happen. This happens a lot, of course, in the context of feminism, where women are not believed when they show that they're being victimized, but it also happens to any group that is being designated as the enemy within. When that group says, hey, we're being treated like second-class citizens, the government or people in power will say, I don't see it. And there's a great example that I talk about in my book where because of the fact that the War Department in the 19th century employed anthropologists to go in and help with Indigenous removal, they actually managed to generate a lot of historical receipts about what those Indigenous nations and tribes were doing and what their languages were, what their traditions and cultures were. Anthropologists were taking notes, keeping notebooks. I went to an Indigenous archive up in Oregon at the University of Oregon at Eugene. And it's an archive that is a huge number of papers generated by the War Department and associated groups during the late 19th and early 20th centuries about the local tribes in Southwest Oregon. And it was created by the now chief of the Coquel tribe. At the time that he was working on it, he was a grad student. And he went to the National Archives in our capital and got the librarians to Xerox 60,000 documents for him related to his tribe and the neighboring tribes in the area, the Coos and a bunch of other folks. And that archive is a fantastic bulwark against PSYOPs because it is a set of written documents showing what the government did, including relocating kids to residential schools, including taking away land from the local tribes. It has maps, it has photographs, it has records of names and languages. And, some librarian literally stored all that stuff in boxes. And 100 years later, it was used by the tribe to help shore up their claim for their ancestral lands and also to maintain information about their own history. It's a really incredible story, and there's Indigenous archives like that all over the United States. And so libraries and archives have a huge role to play in fighting back against culture war by simply keeping records of what is happening, because people in the future need to know. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than knowing your history. And finally, I want to get back to pop culture, and this may answer the question that someone was asking about mass culture. So one of the most powerful stories that pushed back against culture war or that kind of de-escalated culture war in the 20th century is Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman, of course, was the creation of William Moulton Marston, who was a psychologist and a feminist, and he wanted to create pro-feminist propaganda. And he's on the record saying that, I want to create something that is propaganda on behalf of female power. And he's doing this, in the late 30s and early 40s when he's kind of coming up with this idea. And it's during the rise of fascism in Europe. It's during a period of backlash against women after they've gotten the vote. And he's like, what if we just create a character who's a woman who has power and we just let her loose and we just have this icon that women can look at and identify with. And in the early issues of Wonder Woman, each issue ended with a short historical nonfiction story about a real woman who had done awesome things in history. And so it was clearly intended to be, here's a fun story about a cool lady, and also we're going to slip in some actual facts about real women who've been powerful. So it contains all the elements of propaganda being used for good. And Wonder Woman continued to basically be a character in print all the way up into the present. There have been some times when she's kind of been relegated to being a side character, but she's basically had her own book that whole time. And that's because of her popularity, because readers continue to demand stories about her. And even in the modern day, women and non-binary people and trans people have continued to tell stories using Wonder Woman to push back against narratives about women not deserving power, women not deserving control over their bodies. I interviewed Vida Ayala, who is both a comic book creator and editor, and they worked on a series of comics about Nubia, who's an Amazon who lives on Themyscira, Wonder Woman's hometown. And it's a story from 2021, and Nubia is a Black character, and the whole arc, her whole arc in the comic is basically a prison abolition arc. It's all about getting rid of prisons on Themyscira. So Wonder Woman and her world have continued to be a way that people can tell new kinds of stories that push back against negative stories about women and their power. So it's just one example. There's many, many other examples of how fictional stories have been used to push back against toxic narratives. And of course, also pop culture isn't only fiction. Pop culture can also be social media. Pop culture can also be anything that is massively consumed by the public. And so if you see, pushback from feminist memes on a social platform, that can also serve the same function that Wonder Woman does in the public sphere. So it doesn't have to be some fancy comic book or fancy movie that's funded by Hollywood. It can also be just a group of people making popular memes and popular messages and images, and those can do a lot to light the way forward for people who are feeling besieged by psyops in a culture war. So I just want to conclude by saying that what we're looking at here is a long history of how military grade weapons for undermining the morale of a foreign adversary have been used in domestic conflicts by Americans against other Americans. So there's been this, it's not that we're not engaging in psychological war against foreign adversaries. We are. We continue to do that as a nation. But now we have a kind of parallel track where we also engage in culture wars against each other. And it's generally the powerful waging those wars against the marginal and people with fewer resources. And there's common places where those culture wars break out. Like I said, they often break out around education. They break out in the arenas of pop culture, and they include all kinds of violent threats, and they're associated with violence and with threats to people's livelihood. And so that's the kind of commonality between a psyop and culture war and a psyop in a military conflict. But they have the same effect. They leave us feeling confused, traumatized, alone. And so that's why, as we come together to try to push back against these narratives that are going to become increasingly vitriolic in our culture war, we need to remember my list of suggestions, which could be a list of 20 things. But again, build schools, keep receipts, and tell better stories, and find your allies and work with them. So I'm going to leave it there and then open this up for questions. There's probably a lot of stuff that you're curious about that I haven't gotten to. I haven't really talked that much about the internet, although I do talk about it in the book. So if there are questions, let me know.
Thank you so much for this this fascinating presentation and look into propaganda and history of psyops. This is really great. We do have some questions. I'll just remind everyone you can submit them via the Q&A or even do the raise hand function. But there's one question that said it's talking about I'll just read it directly. Do you think that this essay, which portrayed America as taking on native culture as they were destroyed, is where we get white Americans claiming distant native ancestry?
Yeah, oh, 100%. Yeah, the whole myth of like um the Frederick Jackson Turner idea that we're going to absorb indigenous culture, and by we I mean white settlers, um definitely leads to that kind of mythologizing. Absolutely. Um it also interestingly, and I talk about this a bit in the book, it's kind of the original white replacement theory, except turned on its head, because it's all about how white people will replace indigenous people, and that's the right way to go. So I found that so interesting when I was reading it, that I was like, wait, this is white replacement. So yeah, there's a lot of terrible things that came out of that essay.
Yeah.
I want to
Uh,
just make sure I answer this one question at the top of the chat too,
yeah.
from Patrick Rogers. I hope I kind of already answered this, but Patrick is asking how I can make a connection between pop culture that is media created by creators versus platforms where people are creating messages specifically for propaganda. So like there's kind of daylight between something like um, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is arguably just a silly sci-fi movie, versus somebody on X being like, I specifically hate Black people, and here is a meme about that. Um, there is a difference between those two things, but they can function in the public sphere to reinforce each other. So you can have a kind of psychological undercurrent in a piece of pop culture. Sometimes it's very obvious, like in a show like 24, which is like very much about the war on terror and how awesome it is. Sometimes it's kind of buried. And then, of course, you have overt propaganda, which is, again, sometimes it is actually funded by a state actor, right? Like, so we have, for example, on X, people who are paid by the Russian government to go in there and make memes. And that is different from somebody who's like making a movie that's a right-wing movie. But they function together. So that's why I kind of put them in the same bucket as using pop culture to push a message. Sometimes it's a message that is very intentional, and sometimes it's a message that's received by a group um, as intentional, even if it's not. So, for example, like with the Matrix creating the whole idea of red pilling, that wasn't intended. The women who made the Matrix definitely would not have been down with that idea, but it became a meme that got taken up by a whole community of people. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I just wanted to make sure I hit that because I suspect other people were wondering too.
They did respond and said, I hear that, but I feel like pop culture can often assume the guise of mainstream, but steadily subverts the leadership.
Yep,
Um,
definitely pop
yeah.
culture can subvert leadership as well. It can
Yeah.
go both ways. That's why we have culture war. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it, I can tie this into there was a question that I had that I tie it into one two here because there's one that says, how do we reach the people who are only consuming very siloed media and social media platforms? But I was curious, like, does the scale of social media and how algorithms work change how we deal with propaganda from like the kind of examples that you're saying? And like even the thing of saying like keeping receipts, it's like feels like sometimes the volume of things just like drowns out and feels almost pointless or hopeless, like keeping said receipts because it feels like you can't like hold people accountable sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's real. And I mean, I think that is part of the fear around these siloed media platforms, right? That they create what people have called filter bubbles. Um, the goal in de-escalating culture war is not to reach everyone. The fact is that you'll never be able to reach everyone. And so I wouldn't encourage anyone to feel like they're failing at resistance if they can't reach the people on Truth Social or something like that. But what we can do is, build up new communities and hope to attract people to those communities who are empathetic to democracy, who are empathetic to the position of marginalized people in a democracy. And as for whether social media changes the equation, it does in some ways. I mean, it changes how fast propaganda can spread. And certainly using AI makes it easier to create propaganda because you just have, your large language model spewing out whatever propaganda you want. But I don't think it changes the basic mechanism of how propaganda works. Because remember, one way that one form that a PSYOP can take is flooding the zone, as Steve Bannon would say, flooding the zone with disinformation, misinformation, confusing, contradictory information. So if you have a social media platform that is constantly using the algorithm to surface more and more information that is contradictory, or there's so much of it that you feel overwhelmed, you're being targeted by a PSYOP. That's part of what you're supposed to feel. It's like, oh, there's so much. How could I ever possibly keep receipts? The answer is you can't keep them all, but you can focus on one thing. You can make sure, for example, that people don't ban books in your own library, right? In your own local community library. You can make sure that you can fight that fight at the local level. Or you can pick an area that you want to focus on. Like maybe you're very active in a trans community in San Francisco. I'm just going to pick that because that's my community in San Francisco. You can focus on keeping a history of that community and maintaining it. And that's why I think that example of the Coquel tribe retrieving documents related to their history and the history of their neighboring tribes is so important, because it gives a great picture of how having a local history can actually be very powerful, even though it's not a history of every single Indigenous group in the United States. And some of those tribes and nations have lost access to their history. Having that one piece of history is important. And again, we can't do everything, but we can do what we're good at. We can focus on the things we know.
Thank you.
Somebody asked, somebody said, can I repeat the list of things we do to fight back? Build schools, keep receipts, tell better stories.
It's a great, succinct.
There's more, plenty more to do, but those are the three that are really important.
There's a question, has the US intelligence community undergone a cultural shift since the Cold War?
Yeah, that is a really good question. It has, very much so. I can't speak to the whole intelligence community, which of course spans like a lot of different areas. But for my book, of course, I was talking to folks who work in psychological operations. So in other words, messaging that's targeted at a foreign adversary. And those folks do study culture war too. They know it's happening domestically. They don't engage in it, and they often disapprove of it. But one of the things that's really changed is in the 1950s, psychological operations were very well funded. And I think it was relatively widely understood what they did. And these days, almost everyone I've talked to who works in PSYOPs in the military feels like they are totally misunderstood. No one gives them any money or resources. They are freaking out because this is a period of time when the United States is being bombarded with malign foreign influence, is what they call it. Malign foreign influence being just PSYOPs coming from foreign adversaries like Russia or China are two of the ones, and Iran is another one that, of course, they worry about a lot. Not that they aren't coming from other places too. And I just spoke with a group of folks who work in a couple of different branches of the military who were saying, like, we can't get anyone to understand why we need to defend against PSYOPs, why we need to, prevent them from circulating domestically, why we need to prevent them from coming in from outside the country, because people just don't think that's important. And for people in the military and in intelligence, again, as I said earlier on, like, psychological war is kind of the goal, because they're like, okay, if we're not killing each other, like if we can just convince these guys to stop killing each other and just like yelling at each other, that would be great. And from my perspective, of course, I'm looking at the part where we're all screaming at each other and that's causing violence. And so I'm like, can we also get them to not scream at each other too? And the military folks are like, whatever. They're screaming at each other. There's no dead bodies. We're super into that. So it has changed a lot. And I will say, not to freak you out, but one of my main sources for this book is a guy who worked in PsyOps his whole career and taught PsyOps. And he sent me a text message today saying, I can't believe what's happened. It's day 0 of American fascism. I will never be able to text you again. Goodbye. And I was like, okay, thanks. Bye. So they're really freaking out right now. They're not happy with this situation.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a great message to get today.
Yeah. Yeah, the line. But if that's it for questions from everybody, I just want to say thank you so much again for this fascinating talk.
Yeah,
This
thank you.
yeah,
Thank you for
um,
having me.
yeah. This program was recorded and will be on the Cary Library YouTube channel. So if you'd like to watch it again or share it with people, highly recommend. Also, if you're interested in getting any of Annalee's books, you can get them from probably your local bookseller or their website, which I will send out in the recap, or you can get it from our library or the Cary Library or any of the region's libraries. But thank you again, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Annalee.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And please protect your libraries in your local communities. Check books out of your libraries. Say hi to your librarians. They are awesome.
Thank you for that endorsement.
Thanks.
All right. All right. Have a
All
good
right.
evening.
Good evening. Bye now.